There is something you have been carrying for a very long time. You may not have a name for it yet, but somewhere beneath the rituals, the affirmations, the journals, and the carefully arranged spiritual routine you have built around yourself, there is a weight that none of it has been able to lift, and if you are being truly honest with yourself, you already know this. You have done the work. You have read the books. You have sat in silence and asked the right questions. And still, something remains. Something dense and familiar and quietly exhausting that seems to move with you no matter how deliberately you try to rise above it. Carl Jung spent the better part of a lifetime studying exactly this phenomenon, and what he found was not comfortable. It was not what the modern spiritual world wants you to hear, but it was the truth. And it was precise. What you are about to understand today may be the single most important thing you have ever encountered on the subject of genuine psychological elevation. Not because it tells you what to add to your life, but because it tells you with unflinching clarity what you must finally be willing to release from it. Stay with this, all the way through, because what Jung discovered does not begin to work until you allow it to reach you completely. If this message resonates with you, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the deeper meanings behind human behavior. Jung made a distinction that the contemporary spiritual marketplace has spent decades quietly erasing, because it is not profitable to acknowledge it. The distinction was this: there is a difference between elevation and escape. Most people who believe they are raising their vibration are actually, at the level of the unconscious, doing something else entirely. They are constructing a more elaborate, more aesthetically convincing, more spiritually sophisticated version of the same avoidance they have always practiced. The meditation cushion replaces the distraction. The affirmation replaces the suppression. The high vibration vocabulary replaces the old defenses. But the underlying architecture remains identical because the thing that built it has never been examined honestly. Jung called this inflation, the ego borrowing the language of transcendence to protect itself from the work that genuine transcendence actually demands. And here is what makes this so difficult to see clearly. Inflation feels like growth. It has the texture and the vocabulary of spiritual advancement. It generates real feelings of elevation, of expansion, of being above the ordinary frequency of unconscious living. But it is, at its foundation, the same mechanism that has always kept you in place, simply dressed in new and more convincing clothes. This is not a message designed to discourage you. It is a message designed to redirect you, because the elevation you are genuinely seeking is real. It is available. It is not far from you. But the path to it runs directly through the 5 things most people spend their entire spiritual lives carefully, brilliantly, and unconsciously avoiding. Jung's framework for what he called individuation was built on a foundation that most seekers miss entirely. Individuation is the process of becoming psychologically whole, not the performance of wholeness, not the vocabulary of wholeness, the actual interior event of it. And that process, Jung observed with consistency across decades of clinical practice, does not happen by accumulation. It happens by subtraction. Your authentic frequency, what people are pointing toward when they speak of vibrating higher, is not a destination above you waiting to be reached through sustained spiritual effort. It is already present. It is your original state. It has simply been covered, layer by layer, by the defensive structures your psyche built in response to a world that, at critical moments in your formation, felt unsafe, Those structures do not dissolve through positive thinking. They cannot be bypassed through visualization. They are not impressed by the sophistication of your spiritual practice. They dissolve only through one thing: honest, courageous, sustained contact with what you have been avoiding. Until you make the unconscious conscious, Jung wrote, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. There are 5 specific things he identified, 5 precise patterns that are the most common and most consistently invisible anchors, keeping people vibrating at a frequency far below what their genuine nature makes possible. Today, we are going to walk through all 5, why each one is harder to release than you currently believe, how each one keeps you in a frequency of fear rather than freedom, and what becomes genuinely possible when you finally allow them to go. The first thing you must release is the need for other people to understand you. Jung identified this as one of the most quietly devastating patterns he observed across his clinical work. Quietly, because it masquerades so convincingly as something reasonable, as something to which you are almost obviously entitled. You had an experience. You made a choice. You feel something deeply and genuinely, and you want the people in your life to understand it. What could possibly be harmful about that? What is harmful is not the wanting itself. It is the dependency. The way so many people have organized their entire relationship with their own experience around whether someone else can confirm it, can receive it, can reflect it back to them with sufficient accuracy to make it feel real. Consider honestly how much of your psychological energy in any given week is spent attempting to make someone understand something about you. You replay the conversation. You find the better explanation. You try a different angle. You clarify, qualify, expand, and adjust your framing until what you are presenting feels acceptable enough, comprehensible enough, that the other person will finally stop withholding the validation you have been waiting for. And when they still do not understand, there is a specific and familiar collapse, because something in you was staking its coherence on their comprehension. Jung was precise about what this reveals. If you require external understanding to feel solid in your own experience, you have not yet developed internal authority. You are outsourcing your relationship with reality to other people's capacity to receive it. And that outsourcing, that fundamental dependency on external validation for your basic sense of psychological groundedness, is one of the lowest frequencies a conscious being can operate from. It is the frequency of someone still waiting for permission to exist as they are. What Jung observed in individuals who had genuinely elevated their consciousness was something entirely different. They could share their interior world when someone was capable of receiving it, but they did not require that reception to remain rooted in what they knew. They knew what they felt. They knew what was true for them. And whether the person in front of them could follow them there or not did not alter the reality of it by a single degree. This is what internal authority actually feels like, and it is not indifference to others. It is groundedness that no longer depends on others. You will know you have released this pattern when you are completely misunderstood by someone whose opinion once mattered enormously, and you feel genuinely, surprisingly stable. When you can walk away from a conversation in which you were entirely unseen without the compulsion to return and try again. When your knowing no longer requires consensus in order to hold its shape. That stability is not coldness, it is sovereignty, and it is what vibrating higher actually feels like from the inside. Leave the number 111 in the comments below. In the symbolic language Jung used to describe the interior journey, 111 represents the first genuine activation of internal authority. The moment when a person stops requiring external comprehension in order to trust their own knowing. If releasing the need to be understood is the most immediate and most pressing work for where you are right now, 111 is your signal. The second thing you must release is your need to be perceived as a good person. Jung called the constructed identity we present to the world the persona, the mask of acceptability, the carefully maintained surface that was built, often in the earliest years of life, to earn approval and avoid the specific terror that disapproval once represented. And his clinical observation was unequivocal. You cannot vibrate at a genuinely elevated frequency while your primary relationship with the world is organized around how you appear within it. Think honestly about the energy you spend managing other people's perception of you. You silence the anger, because anger is not a high vibration response, and you need to be seen as evolved. You override the boundary, because compassionate people are forgiving, and you need to be seen as compassionate. You exhaust yourself, being available, being gentle, being the one who never says the difficult thing, because all of that is what good people do. And somewhere beneath the performance, your psychological safety still depends on being seen as good. Jung's observation was that this is not goodness. It is fear wearing the costume of goodness. It is the energy of someone who cannot allow themselves to be anything other than acceptable, because the original experience of being unacceptable was, at some point, genuinely too much to survive. And that fear, that constant, vigilant monitoring of whether you are appearing sufficiently kind, sufficiently evolved, sufficiently beyond reproach, keeps you in the frequency of conditional existence, the frequency of a self that is only safe when it is approved of. What Jung found in people who had genuinely elevated was not that they became unkind. It was that they became honest. And honest looked different from what most people expect. It meant they could be deeply generous, and they could also say no without an apology that takes 4 paragraphs to complete. They could be genuinely compassionate, and they could also name what was true and difficult without softening it into palatability. They could be kind from actual abundance rather than from the terror of being seen as unkind. They had released the performance, and in doing so, they had become something the performance could never be. Real. People around them found this uncomfortable, because a human being who has genuinely stopped performing goodness cannot be manipulated through guilt, cannot be shamed into compliance. They have already accepted that some people will find them selfish, or difficult, or disappointing, and they have made genuine peace with that. Leave the number 444 in the comments. In the symbolic and psychological language that informed Jung's understanding of the journey toward wholeness, 444 represents the stable interior foundation that makes releasing the persona possible. The discovery that authentic expression is considerably more solid, more sustaining, and more real than any performance could ever be. If releasing the need to be seen as good is the work that is calling you most urgently, 444 marks that threshold. The third thing you must release is the belief that it is your responsibility to heal other people. Jung studied what he called the wounded healer archetype, with considerable depth and with considerable concern. The pattern of compulsive helping, compulsive rescuing, compulsive availability for other people's pain, and he was careful to distinguish authentic compassion from its more common and more psychologically complex impersonator. Authentic compassion flows from genuine surplus. It is freely chosen. It responds to what is actually needed and actually requested. It can be offered, and it can be withheld. It is not organized around the giver's need. What Jung observed in the wounded healer was something else entirely. The compulsion to help that arises not from surplus but from wound. The desperate, unconscious need to be needed. The entire sense of psychological worth that has been constructed, usually from an early age, around other people requiring your presence, your energy, your capacity to absorb and address their pain. You may have been told repeatedly and sincerely that your deep empathy and your instinct to help is a gift, evidence of your spiritual advancement, a sign of your elevated consciousness. Jung would ask you to look more honestly at the mechanics of it. Are you helping people who asked for your help? Or are you inserting yourself into situations where the help was not requested, because the role of helper is something you cannot afford to lose? Are you supporting people in genuine growth? Or are you unconsciously surrounding yourself with people who cannot fully heal, because their ongoing need for you is the thing that makes you feel indispensable, purposeful, safe? The wounded healer, Jung observed, is frequently addicted to the wound in others, not out of malice, but out of an unconscious recognition that their own identity would not survive those people becoming whole. Releasing this compulsion is not about becoming unavailable. It is not indifference. It is the specific and honest work of developing the discernment to know the difference between genuine service and compulsive rescuing, between helping because you genuinely have something to offer and helping because you cannot tolerate the feeling of not being needed. It is accepting, with real honesty, that other people's pain is not yours to absorb, that your worth is not measured by how many people depend on you, and that sometimes the most loving thing available is not intervention, but the respectful act of allowing someone to encounter the teacher that their own consequences have become. Leave the number 528 in the comments. In the vibrational and archetypal framework Jung developed, 528 represents the frequency of compassion that flows from genuine wholeness. Care that does not require the suffering of others in order to sustain its sense of purpose. If you recognize the wounded healer pattern operating in your own life, 528 is your signal. The fourth thing you must release is the most confronting of all five, the identity of being wounded. Jung observed with genuine consistency that enormous numbers of people who engage sincerely and even courageously with healing work never arrive at the destination that work is supposed to lead toward. Not because the work was insincere, not because the method was wrong, but because somewhere along the path, a subtle and devastating inversion occurred. The wound, which was supposed to be what they were healing, became who they were. Everything Jung said about the necessity of acknowledging pain, of tracing the threads that connect present patterns to formative experiences, of feeling what was suppressed, of understanding how early harm shaped the architecture of adult psychology. All of it is true, and all of it is necessary. But it is the beginning of the journey, not the destination. What Jung observed is that people can spend years doing genuine interior work and still remain fundamentally identified as someone who was hurt, who introduces themselves to new people and to themselves, primarily through the lens of what was done to them, who measures what is possible in their life through the specific parameters that their wound identity has established, whose choices, relationships, and sense of self are still organized around the gravitational center of the original harm. This is what Jung called operating from victim consciousness, not a judgment, not a dismissal of the reality of harm, a precise psychological description of what happens when the orientation to the present moment is perpetually filtered through what happened in the past. The wound determines what feels safe. The wound determines what feels possible. The wound determines who you believe you are, what you believe you deserve, what you believe the world will and will not offer you. And because the wound is always present, filtering everything, the frequency of the wound is always present too, regardless of how many years of healing work have been layered on top of it. What Jung found in people who had genuinely elevated their consciousness was that they had reached a specific and necessary threshold. The wound had been fully met, fully felt, fully understood, and then, without denial and without drama, fully released as a primary identity. They still had the history. The experiences were still part of the full and complex story of their life. But they were no longer the story. They were no longer the lens through which everything else was read. These people were more interested in who they were becoming than in explaining who they were because of what happened to them. They faced forward, not because they were running from anything, but because genuine integration had finally set them free to move. You will know this release has occurred when you can speak about your past without it being the most relevant thing about you. When your history is not the first credential you offer in new relationships. When you are genuinely, not performatively, more engaged by the question of who you are choosing to become than by the narrative of what you have survived. Leave the number 777 in the comments. In the deep archetypal framework that informed Jung's understanding of the psyche's movement toward wholeness, 777 represents the alignment of individual consciousness with its most integrated and most authentic expression. The specific threshold where a person steps fully out of the identity of wound and into the identity of becoming. If releasing the wounded identity is the work your psychology is calling you toward with the greatest urgency right now, 777 is your declaration. The fifth and final thing you must release is the most quietly devastating of all five. It is the imagined version of the people in your life, the person they could become if they did the work, if they healed, if they finally made different choices, if the version of them you can so clearly see the seeds of was allowed to fully grow. Jung called this mechanism projection, and he identified it as one of the most pervasive and most elegantly disguised traps in all of human psychology, because it presents itself as love. It presents itself as patience, as faith, as the generous refusal to give up on someone's potential. It feels noble. It feels evolved. But what it actually is, Jung observed with clinical precision, is a relationship conducted almost entirely with a person who does not exist. You meet someone. You perceive their potential, who they might become. The person that lives just beneath the surface, if only the right circumstances aligned or the right support arrived, or the right moment of genuine connection finally broke through. And you pour your emotional investment, your patience, your psychological energy, your time and your hope and your grief is into your relationship with that imagined person, while the actual person in front of you, who has been consistently and clearly showing you who they are, remains somehow secondary to the vision you are maintaining of who they could be. You extend infinite patience to people who have shown you the same patterns with complete consistency. You stay in relationships that are not serving you because you can see the potential you believe is dormant in the other person, and it feels like abandonment to leave before that potential emerges. You return again and again to the parent, the partner, the friend, believing that this time, with the right words or the right approach, something will finally shift. Jung was clear about what is actually operating in this pattern. You are not perceiving their potential with the clarity of genuine insight. You are projecting your own unmet psychological needs onto another person and relating to that projection as though it were a real human being who could actually materialize under the right conditions. Maybe you need them to be capable so that you do not have to face the full reality of your own situation. Maybe you need them to finally see you so that you can release the ancient ache of being unseen. Maybe you need them to change so that you do not have to make the genuinely difficult choice that seeing them clearly would require. Whatever the need is, it belongs to you. And the fantasy of their potential is, at its foundation, a way of avoiding the honest encounter with who they actually are. Releasing this fantasy is not about hardening yourself. It is not about becoming cynical about people's capacity for change. People do change. Growth is real, but it happens on its own timeline, for its own reasons, and it cannot be willed into existence by the sustained investment of your hope. Releasing the fantasy means finally seeing the actual person in front of you, with clear eyes and genuine care, and making present tense decisions based on who they are, demonstrably showing you they are, rather than the version of them that lives in your longing. Jung was clear about the cost of this release. It requires grief, real grief, unhurried and honest, the mourning of the person you believed they could become. The vision must be allowed to die before you can encounter the actual human being with the clarity that genuine relationship requires and the respect that both of you actually deserve. Jung's framework for genuine psychological elevation was simultaneously simple to understand and demanding beyond easy measure to actually practice. You want to vibrate higher? Stop accumulating. Start releasing. Cut loose the patterns that belong to a lower frequency and allow them, with patience and with grief, to reach their natural end. Release the need to be understood, and internal authority becomes possible. Release the performance of goodness, and authentic expression emerges. Release the compulsion to save everyone, and genuine compassion, clean and free, becomes available. Release the identity of wound, and the fullness of who you actually are begins to come forward. Release the fantasy of who people could become, and real presence, real contact, real relationship becomes possible for the first time. Most people will never make these releases, not because they lack intelligence or sincerity or genuine desire for growth, but because each one of them is, as Jung understood, a genuine death, not a metaphor for death, an actual psychological ending of an identity, a pattern, a way of organizing existence that has been present for years, sometimes for decades. And we avoid death with everything we have. So people continue acquiring more sophisticated spiritual practices and more elevated vocabulary and more carefully curated environments. They meditate and they journal and they consume content about consciousness. and none of it produces the genuine elevation they are seeking, because they are attempting to layer high-frequency practices over a psychological foundation that still belongs to a lower frequency entirely. Jung's message was this: the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Sit with that sentence for a moment. Do not rush past it. The persona you have been performing, the help you have been compulsively offering, the need to be understood that has been quietly draining you for years, the wounded identity you have been both suffering under and deriving meaning from simultaneously, the fantasy of who people could become that has kept you in relationship with your own projection, rather than with the living, imperfect, actual human being in front of you. To accept yourself completely means accepting your anger alongside your gentleness, your limits alongside your generosity, your genuine needs alongside your capacity for care, your inability to save everyone alongside your authentic love for people, your right to be entirely misunderstood and to remain entirely intact. That acceptance, Jung observed, is not a comfortable arrival. It is a radical, ongoing, sometimes frightening act of presence. But it is the only path that leads to genuine elevation, not the feeling of elevation, not the performance of it, the real thing, the frequency that does not require maintenance because it is no longer a construction. It is simply what remains when everything that was never truly yours has finally been allowed to fall away. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. That is not an affirmation to be repeated until it feels true. It is a declaration that becomes true the moment you stop organizing your present reality around the history of your past suffering. The wounds were real. The harm was real. The intelligent adaptations your psychology developed in response to that harm were entirely necessary in the moment they were formed. And you are not required to carry them as your primary identity for one moment longer than they genuinely serve you. What you choose to become now, knowing everything you know, having been through everything you have been through, is the most authentic and the most powerful version of yourself that is available. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung wrote, is to become who you truly are, not who your wounds conditioned you to be, not who your need for validation performed you into, not who the spiritual marketplace offered you as the aspirational end state of sufficient practice and sufficient effort. Who you actually are, beneath every defense, beneath every mask, beneath every fantasy and every wound and every elaborate avoidance. That becoming is not a destination approaching from the future. It is a choice available in this exact moment, by deciding that the release is worth what it costs. It is worth what it costs. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with this genuinely before you respond. Of the 5 releases we walked through today, the need to be understood, the performance of goodness, the compulsion to help everyone, the identity built on wound, and the fantasy of who people could become, which one landed with the most weight? Which one did some quiet part of you recognize immediately as the specific thing you have been carrying the longest? And are you willing, right now, to begin the work of letting it go? Leave your answer in the comments, because your recognition of this truth is the first genuine movement of it, releasing its hold on you, and you deserve to finally know what it feels like to be free of it.